Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. My name is Tony Showella. My pronouns are she and her, and I am the operations lead for RSA US. I would like to thank all of you for joining us for this month's US Salon, Beyond Architecture, Lenses for the Living City. Before we get started, I'd like to give a little bit of background on the RSA, RSA US, as well as share some ground rules. And I'm going to share my screen as well so that you can see this lovely PowerPoint presentation. Okay. So the RSA was founded in the UK. We are the Royal Society for Arts, Manufacturers, and Commerce and have been uniting people and ideas to resolve the challenges of our time since 1754. Today, the Society exists as an international fellowship-driven social change organization. We're committed to a world that is resilient, rebalanced, and regenerative, where everyone can fulfill their potential. Our proven change process, rigorous research, innovative ideas platforms, and unique global network of more than 31,000 change makers work collectively to enable people, places, and the planet to flourish. Of the 31,000 fellows spread out around the globe, about 1,100 live and work here in the United States, including today's moderator, Shaun Fynn. RSA US exists to coordinate fellowship activities in the United States with an aim towards moving the needle on addressing the inequities of our society. Before I turn things over to Shaun, I'd like to cover some ground rules about today's event, and you may have seen these already if you joined us a bit early. So we always like to let you know that this event is being recorded. So you may want to consider renaming yourself with your first name and your last initial, as well as where you're joining us from. You're also welcome to include your pronouns if you're comfortable doing so. Some of the best practices we have around events and norms and things that we encourage are using language that celebrates people's humanity, creating space for all voices, which may mean showing up a little bit differently in this space than you typically would, considering your impact, and then connecting with one another authentically, which we know may look different today than it would another day, but we hold space for that and we honor that. Also, if you need to chat about anything, you can reach out to me via RSA US events, just through the direct message chat via Zoom, or my colleague Claire Byrne, who's also joining us today. And we're super excited to have her support and presence in this space. Now, without further ado, let me turn it over to Shaun Fynn, who will be today's moderator. In addition to being a fellow with the RSA, he is also an author, a visual storyteller, and a photographer. So take it away, Shaun.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for hosting this event. I'd just like to also mention here that our panel here, we have a conversation between New York, London, and Paris. MariaFrancesca is in London and Philippe is in Paris. So the wonderful benefits of doing online events is, bringing us all together. I will just go on to my screen share. So can we see that, guys?
Yeah, looks good.
All looks good. So the conversation about lenses for the living city, right? This idea of beyond architecture. I think we often think about architecture, design, building, etc., as something that is, very inclusive to itself. And I think this idea of how to establish lenses to see it is very important. So, just a second. The conversation that we're going to have today is structured into essentially three parts. And there's sort of an underlying premise here that visual literacy is fundamental to creating better outcomes. So visual literacy is, I think, a very important kind of underlying topic of this entire debate. So part one will start with two books that I'm the photographer and author of. Chandigarh Revealed, that's Le Corbusier's City Today, and Departures, A Journey with India. Now, both books are actually photographic books done in India. I lived in India for many years. But one thing to note is, I think when we get into it, the themes that these books explore, promote, are really global issues. They just so happen to be through the lens of India. Then part two, we'll get into learning how to see the built world, because we are the first people to ask this question. The history of photojournalism, architecture, art has frequently visited this subject of how do we even visualize and understand the world we're building, which I think is a very key part of this debate. And then part three, we're going to sort of think about what the futures might be. How will we evolve our visual literacy, our methods of seeing, our methods of doing? So first section here, Chandigarh Revealed and Departures. There are a number of themes these books explore, but in a very short overview, Chandigarh Revealed is based on Le Corbusier's Chandigarh, the capital of the Indian Punjab. So it was an investigation into the works of modernism and the works of modernism and it's sort of how I would say, it's collision with contemporary Indian culture. So it looks at a very modern world, a very planned world. Departures is much more based in the 21st century, and it's really looking at this idea of planned versus unplanned. Like, what kind of cities are we building today? How do we know what their futures are? So these are the kind of themes that will come up through looking at these images. So what I'm going to do now, I'm just going to show you guys just a few images from each of these books. I'm not going to go into any particular great depth about them, but I just want to show you what the visual content explores. So yeah, Chandigarh Revealed was published in 2017 by Princeton Architectural Press and also Mappin Publishing in India. So in a very traditional way, it starts off with documentary of structure and forms, homage to architecture. So the beginning of the book is very much about this idea of, actually Corbusier's largest ever commission, is my understanding. And this particular, these images we're going to look at now very much start with the idea of like this almost a homage to the architecture, but the book is deliberately not a homage to the architect himself. It's far more of an inquiry about what the city has become. So, to give Corbusier his due credit, it's magnificent. It's an incredible piece of work. So as I say, we start by looking at it from a very form-based point of view, structures, relationship between structures and space. But as the book goes on, we start to peel back the layers of the onion, so to speak, and look at things like, what does it really look like? So rather than, perpetuating the notion of beauty shots and homage to architecture, we start to move into, what is the human impact? What is the relationship of this architecture with the actual way people live with it? This is interesting because this is a shot from the top of the High Court building in the Punjab. And all of these chairs you see here were generally discarded, but I believe these are actually by Corbusier and Pierre Gensler, and they sell at $10,000 plus illegally on New York auction markets. And then, why do a picture like this, really? It's like, well, again, we're departing from this idea of just homage to architecture and starting to look at how the city really is. Who are the inhabitants? I mean, these images become kind of revealing in certain senses that, you start to see, well, how is the building actually being used? And if you can see up in the top left, there is a guy there having his morning prayer. So moving further on, it's like, well, who are the inhabitants of these buildings? We start to document the people, the culture, the activities. This is from the canteen of the Secretariat building. And then what becomes more and more interesting to me is actually the marks, that humans leave on the landscape, the marks that humans leave on the buildings. Again, these kind of images aren't what you might typically see in an architecture book, but that was deliberately the point. Because part of the idea is not just documenting walls and structures and shapes, but what is the life between the walls. And much of my own influences come from actually social realist photographers, Peter Marlowe, Marc Ribot, these kind of people. So the approach is very much a social realist one, to try and tell the real story of a place. The picture on the left here is actually bus drivers on strike. And on the right here is a young inhabitant of actually some of the buildings that weren't complete in one of the Sector 17 of Chandigarh. Not all of the structures were fully completed, but they have become inhabited. And then more of this kind of relationship of people against structure, against architecture, against material, concrete. And this is actually a government office in Chandigarh. So the notion of work will be a reoccurring theory, because obviously our cities are places of work. So one of the ideas is to document these things. And also housing. What does a kitchen look like in Chandigarh? And also, the planned and the unplanned, the scars left in unintentional manners. Work, and also reference to bureaucracy, the symbols of bureaucracy. Departures was the follow-on book published end of 2022, beginning of 2023. And it had, the name behind the book is based on three basic ideas. It's Departures as a fantastic, beautiful journey through a fascinating land. It's also intended to be a departure from stereotypical photography of India, because most consumption of photography, and definitely to Western audiences, is very much based on, stereotypical ideas and historical ideas, a past that no longer exists, etc. So the imagery in here was supposed to address a modern contemporary India. And the third level to Departures is this idea that, eventually it's a spiritual transcendence idea that, how do we navigate, our passage from material to ethereal, is the way I like to say it. So these two images were put together at the very beginning of the book to promote that question of the cycle of life. On the left is a street kid in, I think that was Calcutta, yes. And on the right is cremation in Varanasi at the burning ghats. So this really helps us, I think, introduce a lot of what our conversation today is about. Is like, well, cities are kind of an urban stage, right? Life plays out. And I think this quote from Shakespeare is, a fabulous example of the human condition. And I think that through imagery and documentary, photography, film, etc., we like to explore the human condition. We'll get onto that a little bit more in the part 2. But this is a new world being built. So this is actually the outskirts of Chandigarh. Nothing to do with the story of Corbusier, but this is really how the new residences are being built. This is from Mumbai, an exploding city in development. And this is actually from the outskirts of Delhi. A lot of these buildings are actually, I believe, referred to as self-built, which means that they're not built under any particular code, are not built under any particular permissions, but a lot of communities are developing around this kind of architecture. And we'll get into this a little bit later. Part of, obviously, urbanization is motion and density. The serendipitous discovery of moments on the street. This is a morning bath for a street kid. This image is actually connected to the one I just showed, actually, of the self-built periphery of Delhi. And again, looking at consumption, right? Because growth is a big topic, right? We pursue growth economically, and we define growth often as economic growth. But there's a paradox to growth and there's a wake to growth. Behind growth are left many other things. So this was a documentary that was also produced by Amita Singh, based on e-waste workers in Delhi. And essentially, this is, the results, or despite restrictions on the export of e-waste from Europe and the United States, much of it ends up in the developing world. This is actually in East Delhi where they're processing electronic waste. And our title picture, just the rapid transition to new forms, new structures. And, looking at these talking about moments, it's actually one of my favorite photographs from the Departures book, is this gentleman here sleeping, having a cigarette underneath one of the major bridges in Ahmedabad. Just compositionally, just that moment of life. And this one was actually taken in Mumbai railway station, and it was sort of a difficult one to try and, categorize. It's almost like it is a sort of the fortunes, let's say the difference in fortunes. On the left comes from Varanasi, where the sign, which I believe is placed by Varanasi police, I do not know particularly why they're so concerned with drone camera surveillance, but Varanasi is the seat or constituency of Mr. Modi, so maybe he has some interest in that. And on the right is the people using the railway lines as urban thoroughfare. More moments. This is from Calcutta. And the same. And work will become, looking at factory life, cafes, office life. And also some of these things were to capture everything from border to bureaucracy to humor. And lastly, urban fabric. These are ideas, and we'll talk a little bit about this later, but these are inspired by the architectural group Archigram, actually, who in the 60s did architectural or collages and city collages, just using simple cutout methods. But this is sort of a way of interpreting that through Photoshop compositions and montage. And I think the idea here was to just sort of accentuate the sense of urban space. Because one thing that these images also discuss is like the life of the urban poor is more visible, but I also think the urban poor are the prime recipients of hostile architecture. Architecture that wasn't thought about, that's sort of, unintentional landscapes like you see here. And lastly, from Varanasi. So just a few slides of work in progress. What I just showed was from 2 books now published, but this is an ongoing debate amongst many, not just myself, and also there's a few photographs here from MariaFrancesca. And we're kind of fascinated with this idea of what does growth really mean? What does it look like? And I think it has many faces.
Yeah, specifically, thank you for having me, by the way. I'm really glad to be here. To echo Shaun's concern, and a concern that we all share as architects, as designers, is that in this fast growth that cities are experiencing, the growth of the city is seems to be out of sync with the growth of the urban environment. So we find ourselves in these new landscapes that are extremely urbanized and not always find a right connection with the real identity of the place. So what you see in these pictures is the relentless need to build and keep building, and very often the new builds and the new districts clash really hard, as you can see in these pictures, could clash really hard with the true identity and historical presence that a city or a urban environment can have. And this not only happens in cities, it happens in more rural area where this phenomenon of sprawl and peri-urbanization leads then to a very hybrid landscapes where you can find the resemblance of of a rural environment with these heroic constructions that are not always, beautifully intertwined or appropriately intertwined with the existence of the city and the landscape. So these are again shown images, and I bet you can add more to what I'm saying. They're beautiful.
I think this slide is just these are sort of ways to, I think, talk about consumption, because part of growth is consumption, part of growth is energy consumption, endless consumption of objects, and there's a certain absurdity, I think, to our obsession with consumption. But again, that goes back to growth, and we define ourselves by it. But I think that's something we need to ask a lot of questions about. And just lastly, that's the picture of Dubai. And this is actually a picture of where the migrant workers live who are building the main buildings in Dubai. And many of these laborers are from Pakistan, they're from the Middle East, they're from India. But this is obviously a very stark contrast to the builders and the occupiers of the buildings.
Yeah, and that leads us to one of the conversations we had earlier this week, that usually growth is associated with energy sources. And as up until now, there was this phenomenon of the city that would embed the energy source, that would lead people to displacement. And now the phenomenon is kind of shifting, where the energy centers are displaced, and then the people should technically sprawl, but that's not always happening.
So going on to our part two, as I mentioned at the very beginning, we're not the first people to try to find visual methods and verbal methods to try and grasp the world we are building. But the next chapter is about, inspiration from those who have also been making this inquiry. And, this idea of a living city, Frank Lloyd Wright actually published a work on this back in 1958, I believe. So that question has been coming up more and more, but also as time changes, our cities are also very different things. And to bring up one of my great inspirations was the Archigram, the British group of the architecture group of the 1960s, who they had a magnificent exhibition called The Living City. And a quote from that is this quote here. And I think what this sort of gets at, this quote is understanding the connection between things. I know famous musicians have said that, but I think it was, I forget exactly, but it might have been Beethoven who said it's not the note, it's the spaces in between. But I think the architects here are also looking for that. And the visualizations I absolutely love, because they dial directly into the pop culture of the 1960s. They also have that wonderful sort of, possible inspiration from Richard Hamilton, the British pop artist. And, this starts to become a really powerful visualization, but really fantastic challenges for what does a city mean? Picture on the left there was, Archigram's proposition of a walking city. And I believe, they received a lot of criticism about things being unbuildable, but on the right here, the more buildable than you believe. Moving on to Thamesmead in London. This was the city of the future. And next slide, I'll show you how this became very famous. But this is one of those, classic sort of rehabilitation of East London, many areas heavily bombed and housing, etc. I believe it's also known as the Cockney Riviera, but you'll recognize this, which was filmed basically in that space. This is Clockwork Orange by Stanley Kubrick. And I think Kubrick's understanding of modernism was fantastic with the locations he chose for this film. It also starts to bring up this idea of, are our future visions dystopian? Are they becoming predominantly dystopian? So I think that, this history here in film is fantastic. And of course, Kubrick is one of the greatest visualizers of all time. Then to move on a little bit into the 1980s, Clockwork Orange was, I think, 71 or 72. There was a fabulous film by Godfrey Reggio, and the music's by Philip Glass. If you guys have not seen this, I highly recommend it. But it's such a fantastic piece to kind of explore this question about the world we're building. And actually, this comment down below, until now you've never really seen the world you live in. That's actually a quote from the trailer, the 2-minute trailer movie promotion they did for this. But it obviously strikes a chord in the fact that the wisdom of the Native American, well, in many ways, is far more advanced than ours. What's the definition of progress when we read these kind of statements? So I think Koyaanisqatsi was a fabulous provocation of and beautifully done. It's actually just a movie. There's no commentary. There's no actors. It's just a movie with film and music by Philip Glass. The top right there was, I believe, that's a demolition. It was a public demolition, actually publicly televised, of a failed housing estate in St. Louis, Missouri. And moving on, anyone have any thoughts on that?
Well, I could add, Shaun, it's a pleasure to be here with everyone. It's interesting because we started with architecture, the buildings of Le Corbusier, and trying to connect that with visual literacy and seeing these images. So as an architect, you're often hearing these conversations or these musings about colleagues who are worried about how their buildings will fare, and someone was asking such a question, and I thought another colleague had a really clever answer. He said, why don't you worry about this? In the end, life always wins, right? And I think what you see here with these examples are, for better or for worse, really extreme images of how, in some ways, life wins, right? And if you talk about visual literacy, sometimes it's not so much about looking at the buildings, but it's looking at how the buildings or the cities or the architecture in some ways gets subverted, overpowered, hacked, and transformed by the forces of life. And maybe to understand cities, you have to focus more on, like you do in your photographs, focus more on looking at life than looking at what typically we describe as a city, which is buildings, right? But it stuck with me. Life always wins, right? For better, for worse. And this is what we're seeing here.
That's very interesting, because have you guys ever seen it's a David Attenborough documentary, his movie, where he starts the movie and ends the movie in Chernobyl. And, at the end of it, he points out that regardless of the disaster of Chernobyl, it's becoming overgrown. Life is reclaiming it. Not humans, but life is reclaiming it.
It's I wanted to echo Shaun's and Philippe's sentiment in these terms, and all I can think of as an architect when we mention the concept of humanity and life that would always win over the built environment is that it's not only that, but it's also shaping. Is an extreme force. Humanity and life is an extreme force that shapes and bends the construction very often and the architecture and readdress its purpose. So I can think of Kowloon walled city. There was this extremely dense walled city in Hong Kong that was, demolished in the 90s, but it kept growing out of its own force and necessities. And that became that became a study point to create architecture that is not only beautiful and accurate and historically relevant, but it's also purposeful for the humanity that lives in it. And there are many, many examples like that. There is Tower David in Caracas, and they're all buildings that eventually change their purpose under the force of humanity, under the force of life.
And just to give one, I love the quote on this: "Visual adventures in a world God never made." I just thought that was a lovely way to sum up what we're creating. And just to quickly talk about, the lineage of photojournalism and social realism has always been a strong player. They've possibly been aware of the outcomes of architecture before the architects themselves. But this is a picture from, Dorothea Lange, and this is from a Japanese store owner in the beginning of the Second World War. Fabulous picture by Peter Marlowe from a book called Liverpool Looking Out to Sea in the 1980s. I think the image speaks for itself. Marc Ribot, the French photographer, who spent a lot of time, well, he's traveled all over the world, one of the best, photographers there is, but he decided to travel to Leeds, the British industrial heartland in the 1950s. And just finishing up this section on, I love Banks, well, everything. Banksy's work is fantastic, but I love this. A wall is a very big weapon, I think. And this is actually an image from Ukraine, and I believe that is Mr. Putin is very keen on judo. So this is an image of Mr. Putin being thrown by a Ukrainian child. Brings up the idea also is graffiti, is it vandalism or is it a genuine urban voice? And I think those additions to the urban world or the built world are very interesting. Any thoughts on this one?
It's a really, really beautiful image, and the fact that we started and we finished talking about this topic regarding walls, regarding architecture, and using the term walls is really telling, where a wall can really shape the course of the path that we take in cities, the path that we take into interiors, and can really create a distance between nations. It's I think is a very powerful, as Banksy said, very powerful weapon.
Yes, he's I think a genius in terms of this kind of thing. And then Aldo Rossi, architecture. Do you guys have any comments on the Rossi book?
No, I mean only that it's so such a influential work in the way it has reframed the city as a receptacle for collective memory. And I think what I find powerful here in Rossi's book is that in some way his thesis is that the city is almost like a living organism that acquires a consciousness of its own over time, made up of layer upon layer of experiences and what people project onto it, and at some point starts to have a life of its own. It has its own codes, its own habits, its own texture, and it is that layering of memories that gives it its patina. And you could, in some ways, juxtapose that against, the modernist ideal of control, of simplification, of magnification of scale, and sort of this idea or ambition that, life can be contained, prescribed, whereas in reality, it's a much messier affair And if from the standpoint that you accept that, it also means that as architects and designer, in some ways, you're a bit humbled by something that's larger and greater than yourself, right? So that you accept that whatever is inserted in the city is actually shaped and molded by everything that is around. Um, and in some ways, we've sort of come full circle. We're about as much in contrast as we could be from what we started with Frank Lloyd Wright, and this, sense of optimism, but really very much one individual's vision, right? I mean, he went as far as putting flying saucers in the sky, right? That's just how out there this was. Whereas now, what happens if we accept and embrace again the messiness of a city's collective memory?
And that leads us on to looking ahead. So, there's a lot of things coming our way. Big debates, big issues. One of the huge issues is, what's the role of AI? Visualizing the future. What would, if we look back at the techniques that we've been reviewing, a lot of it is, film, photography, talking about building. None of it's particularly in the realm of AI, but so what happens next? Will AI add to this story?
This is what Philippe was talking about the idea that Aldo Rossi had of the city that remembers its past. It kind of opens up conversation for how we visualize the city in the future. It could be almost we could almost have a comparison with what Archigram did with what Frank Lloyd Wright did back then. A single individual, a single architect or designer envisioning an entire city. This is what's happening right now. We see um, more often than not, we see architects and designers not coming together in shaping the future of our cities and our cities' identities. What we see is a single individual trying to develop this beautifully crafted environment that doesn't have a memory of its own, that doesn't have an identity that is built over time. What Aldo Rossi was stressing, and this is not to be like too attached to all the Italian architects, but what the philosophy that Aldo Rossi was stressing, the crux of it was that no single human can produce the complexity of a city. It has to be layered in time, in space, and in features. So there is a lot of interest in Aldo Rossi's theory to respect the context and embrace it and include it and acknowledge it. And when we visualize the future, we should be, as architects, as designers, thinkers, we should be asking ourselves, what if I don't have a blank space? It's not so often that on our planet we encounter a fully blank space to work on, and we'll see later on in this presentation that sometimes there's exceptions for that, but no environment is to be considered a blank space because there is none. We've built so much and we keep building that Aldo Rossi's theories today is more influential than we would like to admit.
Mm. And I think, I mean, an interesting point that AI raises is the instinct. In some ways, it generates instant gratification, right? It's a few prompts and you have a visual or an image. But most great cities actually have evolved over extremely long periods of time. And so how do you somehow in the thinking or the rethinking of cities account for the fact that cities evolve over long periods of time, right? And how do you sort of give yourselves the tools that will generate solution that sort of take full advantage of what outcome is born out of the natural slow evolution of cities versus to your point, MariaFrancesca, aiming at solving very, very complex problems in a snap of a finger or the typing of a few prompts. I think there's sometimes a tendency to put too much faith in oversimplification and losing sight that cities have a life of their own.
So moving on to obviously the critical debate of our times, we're obviously at a inflection point in human history and our relationship with the planet. So sustainability is going to be a huge, huge conversation. Any thoughts on the sustainability and the identity?
Well, I can jump in and say that, as you can see, some of these images are artificial intelligence generated. Some are actually pictures of possible solutions. So a positive response to what is the role of AI in the face of this extreme growth and at the verge of this irreparable climate change issues we're facing. So the answer from a designer point of view and a strategic point of view could be, can we use what we know as as designers? Can we use our expertise combined with the power of AI to solve the problem, to create solutions that could be either shelter for emergencies or structures and facilities that are essentially floating on water? Could that save us from literally drowning? Could we turn AI and our expertise into solving the problem of the identity of the cities they may no longer exist, like Venice, for example, or I don't know, alpha of the islands that are scattered around the Pacific Ocean? Could we use that? Could that be a plan for growth, for future growth? And I adore this picture. And when this group and I got together, and we found out that there are already nations like Tuvalu Islands, there are already nations that are experiencing this issue and try to solve the issue of the identity of a place when the place no longer exists. So you see in the picture depicted, this is the mayor of one of the Tuvalu Islands that are outside of far away from Australia, and they're their own state. However, the sea level rising due to climate change is forcing them to leave, but not to leave inland, just to leave, because 90% of these islands are already underwater. So during this conference, the prime minister decided to start relocating the Tuvalu Islands in a digital space. So you see on screen it's a quote from Peak Iyer asking, what is home? Where is home? So maybe home is not land, it's not a piece of soil. Maybe a city's identity is more than the soil is built on.
So as we're approaching Q&A time, we just have a couple more slides to do here, then we'll hand it over to the audience questions. So we just got a few slides to finish with, but this is just the photographs from Shanghai. It's housing in Shanghai, but the data is from the UN in 2018, and it's estimating an additional 2.5 billion people in cities by 2050. Should this data be true, I think it's quite an alarming data set in terms of, well, what are our plans for housing? What are our plans for catering for this mass migration into cities, which is, could be as significant as what the Industrial Revolution was a few hundred years ago. And obviously experience design. Experience design, let's say, it's the conversation of today, but it exists in many levels. It isn't just digital, it's about the entire space. And just quickly about life-centered design, we've had a discussion about this, that if we're going to be truly inclusive, I think that we need to see our cities as a place not where humans just reside, but where multiple life forms reside, plants, animals, etc. And I think that life-centered design is actually a counterbalance or a contrast or the next step from human-centered design, which I've always felt was a little bit too human-centered and missing the point to some degree that successful outcomes, successful solutions will eventually require understanding life-centered design.
And I think Shaun, there's something interesting also about sustainability with the images that you showed, and accepting life forms. So it's almost looking at the city as a landscape. And in fact, from a sustainability standpoint, what we're starting to see, at least here in Europe, is that we're almost conceptualizing existing buildings as material banks. And so as some buildings are becoming obsolete, we're actually literally mining those buildings for materials that could be salvaged, reused, repurposed, and in some ways thinking of them as raw material, right? And the tendency sometimes is just to escape by keeping on moving forward, but maybe there's something to be said for looking inward in those cities that already exist for finding solution or repurposing, as opposed to just keeping consuming and expanding, because at the end of the day the resources are finite. And so I find fascinating those images, both because they're beautiful, they're poetic, but also just makes you think very differently about what cities might represent just as a source of life and materials.
In that terms, what we're as architects here in London, for example, what we strive to do every day, what we try to transmit to our clients and to our colleagues is exactly what you were talking about, Philippe, is trying to find interest in the patina of the existing building. So even if the materials used for the facade and the materials used for the interiors are not brand new, they still maintain their very strong power of creating awe and creating interest in the users. So that's a challenge. That's where AI could help us, because AI is not necessarily generative. It's also machine learning. So that's where the built environment can start inputting those tools and start understanding what can be salvaged from the city, what can be salvaged from this building, and what can be salvaged from this interior space and be reused, and where creatively could we reuse it.
So we'll leave you, the audience will open up to Q&A, and we'd like to leave you with this one final quote here from Italo Calvino. Magnificent. So,
talking about the serendipity we find in cities, and we hope to find that serendipity is less, more and more and more, and not less.
So with that, let's hand it over to Q&A.
All right. Well, thank you all so much. I personally, I feel like I've learned so much through this, and have been challenged and encouraged to think about things in so many different ways. And yes, so anyone who's here with us, if you've got questions for these three lovely beings to ask about the work that they're doing, any of the topics that they have brought up, we've got a couple just to get us started. One of them, I have a question. So I feel like whenever I meet someone or encounter someone who's focused on something that is so exciting, so unique, so reframing, I'm always curious about their story as an individual. So I would love to hear from each of you, um, what art pieces or experiences or things for you all have been catalytic for you on this journey, of thinking about cities in the ways that you have shared with us today. What have been impactful for you as you've been grappling with these concepts and topics?
For me, it was, I think, the history of like social realist photography, I think, because they had a way of seeing that was, beyond what the builders were doing. So I think that those guys, as I mentioned, a few in there, Peter Marlowe, Mark Ribot, many others, yeah, have always been a great inspiration.
For me, well, as an architect, I tend to look into how things are made. And coming from Italy, and from a small country, having traveled the world, what inspired me the most in this research is trying to never start from scratch. I know I keep repeating myself on this, but all the work that is layered, that takes the existing into account, then that's what inspired me the most. One of my, and of course I'm being a photographer, not an architect, I have a lot of I take an inspiration from a lot of different experts, but my one of my favorite photographers is Ivan Van, which is an architecture photographer, and like Shaun, he adores capturing the life in within the space, and he's not shy of showing the ugly parts of building, the parts that don't work. So I always got very excited as architect and photographer of things that are already there and are being used in a different ways. And the way he's shown through his work it was really, really inspiring for me.
And I would say for me, both from the perspective of living in a city like Paris, but also thinking about all the great cities that we might have experienced or traveled to, made an impression, is that in some sense they have something in common that ultimately, they were there before we experienced them, and they'll be there after. And there's something incredibly powerful about this idea of permanence, right? That no matter what your life might be, there's a quality, there's a character, there's a personality, and that is consistent. And when you have the opportunity to be part of it, you're also in some ways connecting with everybody else that, experience that city before you, and those that will do so long after you're gone. And I think that speaks to cultural connections, and in some ways, if you look carefully, for me it's always, I don't know, I've always had this feeling that it just, if you look carefully, maybe this is, about visual literacy, but it can reveal our humanity, or the things that bind us together, right? That because there's sort of this unspoken agreement of how cities work that citizens need to sort of go by, and that's what makes the city work. And I think I think it's a beautiful thing, but it also reveals our humanity. So that's what I'm passionate about.
Yeah, I love that. Thank you so much for sharing that. I know we're running short on time, but for our attendees, if there's any reflections or things that you all want to share in the chat, we would still love to hear from you. I'll do my closing little bit because, like I said, we've only got a couple of minutes left. But thank you all so much. Thank you to each of you, Shaun, Philippe, and MariaFrancesca, for your time and your expertise and your passion in this space. Thank you for all of the attendees who have joined us today. Let me just go over here and share my screen. That real quick. Okay. Oh, it'd be the big green button right there. That's what it is. Okay, you should be able to see it. So if you are interested in learning more about the RSA, joining our community, please visit our website. The information, I know Claire will be popping into the chat for us momentarily. We would love to connect with you, have you join our fellowship. If you are a fellow, we will have space within Circle to be able to continue the conversation. Circle is the RSA's online community platform where we can connect and continue to chat about things. This event, as I mentioned at the beginning, is being recorded. So we will share with you, if you signed up via Eventbrite, you'll get an email with a follow-up that will include a link to the recording as well as all of the various resources and information that have been shared in the chat throughout today's session. And I'm going to stop sharing now, just check the chat real quick and see. Awesome. So it sounds like there's some really neat things that people enjoyed from today's session. So thank you all again so much for joining us. We really appreciate your time, expertise, and talent. And we wish you all a wonderful morning, afternoon, or evening, whatever you're joining us from. So
Thank
thank
you
you
so
all
much,
so much.
everybody. Thanks so much.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.